There are two versions of Alice in Wonderland. The first was written by Lewis Carroll in the summer of 1862 as a private gift for a 10-year-old girl. It was intimate, full of inside jokes, built just for her. The second is the one he published in 1865 for the entire world. Comparing the two is one of the most unsettling exercises you can do with this text, because Carroll didn't just expand the story. He made very specific decisions about what to add, and what he chose to add, what he deliberately injected into the public version, wasn't fantastic nonsense. It was the darkest Victorian reality around him, encoded with the precision of a mathematician who knew exactly what he was doing. And here's the promise I'm making you today. Once you understand what's hidden behind the Mad Hatter, once you know what medicines the Victorians gave their babies to slowly kill them and how Carroll coded it into the book, and once you decode what's behind the baby that turns into a pig, you'll never be able to read this story the way they told you it was. Because Alice in Wonderland is not a fairy tale. It's a code. And Carroll decided, with complete deliberation, to put it inside that children's gift. Let's begin. What Carroll chose to add, and what he deliberately left out of the private gift, was no accident. To understand it, you have to go back to the day it all began. The summer of 1862. A mathematician at Oxford University named Charles Dodgson takes 3 young sisters on a boat ride along the River Thames. The middle daughter, Alice Liddell, is 10 years old. The girl is bored with the heat and the still water. She asks Dodgson to make up a story. "Make it full of nonsense," she tells him. What came out of his mouth that day would become one of the most analyzed texts in literary history. Months later, Dodgson, who published under the pen name Lewis Carroll, delivers the girl a hand-bound manuscript. He titles it Alice's Adventures Underground. It's an intimate gift, packed with references only she would understand, with illustrations he drew himself. And then Carroll makes a decision that academics still debate. He decides to publish it. But he doesn't publish the same text. In the process of preparing it for the world, he adds entire chapters that were never in the private gift. Dark chapters. Disturbing ones. The transformation of the Duchess's baby into a pig. The Hatter's tea party. Sequences the real girl never received. Carroll consciously chose to inject these elements into what was supposedly a children's story. The question is, where did he get them? And this is where the historical record gets genuinely disturbing. Remember those scenes where Alice drinks mysterious liquids and eats strange substances that make her grow and shrink? The counterculture of the 1960s claimed those images as references to psychedelic drugs. The reality is far more disturbing and far closer to home. In Carroll's time, opium was no underground narcotic. It was in almost every Victorian household. Historical records document that 5 out of 6 families regularly consumed laudanum, liquid opium, for all kinds of ailments, from headaches to silencing restless babies. Mothers gave it to their children to make them stop crying. Forensic reports from Carroll's era tell stories that would horrify any parent today. In 1854, a London mother named Sarah Whitfield testified before a coroner's court that she had spent months giving her 6-month-old baby a teaspoon of Godfrey's cordial, an opiate syrup marketed specifically for infants, every night to keep him quiet while she worked her 14-hour shifts at a textile mill. The bottle sat on the mantelpiece next to the family Bible, its sweet smell masking the narcotic inside. One night, she gave him his usual dose. The baby went quiet immediately, as always. But by morning, his lips were blue, and his tiny body was cold. The coroner logged it as accidental laudanum poisoning, one of dozens of similar deaths that same month. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, another best-selling baby product, contained enough morphine sulfate to kill an adult in excess. Its ads featured cherubic babies and promised peaceful nights for mothers. This wasn't underground. It was normal. It was as accepted as giving aspirin. The ease with which Alice consumes those transformative substances reflects exactly the casualness with which Victorians took their daily doses of opiates. But Carroll encoded something even more specific, and he added it deliberately in the version the world was going to read. This scene was not in the private gift for Alice. Carroll added it specifically for publication. Remember the scene with the Duchess and her baby that transforms into a pig? The text describes the infant's disturbing transformation. The eyes grow extremely small for a baby's eyes. The nose begins looking more like a snout than an actual nose. Medical reports from Carroll's era described something chilling and very similar. Doctors wrote the children sickened by chronic narcotic consumption wasted away and shrank, turning into little old men. The parallel is unmistakable. The Duchess's transforming baby isn't nonsense. It's a coded accusation against Victorian mothers who were literally poisoning their children with the everyday use of narcotics. Infant mortality from opiate overdose was, in the clinical language of the time, an extremely common outcome. Carroll took something he saw in the newspapers, in the courts, in the obituary columns of poor neighborhoods, and hid it in a fairy tale that the upper class would carry into their nurseries. The same society that drugged its youngest was slowly poisoning its craftsmen. And in the monotonous silence of the factories, another kind of madness was taking shape. The Mad Hatter, that beloved character known for his absurd tea parties and unanswerable riddles, carries a much darker secret. The English expression, mad as a hatter, wasn't just a quaint Victorian phrase. It described a very real and very horrifying occupational disease that was destroying workers across England. The year is 1860, a hat factory in Stockport. Workers spend their shifts hunched over felting tables, turning rabbit fur into felt for gentlemen's hats. The process uses mercury nitrate, which releases toxic fumes into the air. Thomas Corbett has been exposed for 8 years. Every morning his hands tremble as he lifts the buckets of mercury solution. By midday, the shaking intensifies until he can no longer eat. His wife thinks he's been drinking again. The symptoms of mercury poisoning, the tremors, the slurred speech, the erratic behavior, are indistinguishable from being drunk. His children keep their distance when his behavior turns unpredictable. 2 years later, his speech grows confused and he begins to hallucinate, seeing giant rabbits in the corners of the workshop. His co-workers mock him, calling him mad as a hatter, unaware that he is suffering from mercury poisoning. Eventually, Thomas collapses at his workstation. His nervous system destroyed. The factory replaces him within a week. His widow receives nothing. Hatters in Carroll's era used mercury nitrate to process rabbit fur into felt. Day after day, those workers breathed mercury fumes in poorly ventilated factories. The metal slowly poisoned their nervous systems, causing what doctors called hatter's shakes, an uncontrollable tremor that made it impossible to hold a teacup steady. The poisoning also attacked their minds, causing hallucinations, emotional instability, and speech problems. The medical community had known since 1829. French doctors confirmed the link in 1869. Yet in England, the suffering continued. Factory owners knew. The government knew. The public knew. It was so common there was a saying for it. But nothing changed. The use of mercury in hat manufacturing wasn't banned until 1941, and only then because the army needed mercury for World War II detonators. So when you watch the hatter's strange behavior at his endless tea party, you're not looking at fantastic nonsense. You're looking at Carroll's brilliant encapsulation of systemic indifference to working-class suffering. An entire character built around an industrial disease everyone knew about, but no one bothered to stop. But Carroll wasn't done making his case. His next target was power itself. The Queen of Hearts, with her endless cry of, "Off with their heads!" seems like an exaggerated caricature of authority. Carroll was encoding a very specific political statement.
The scene in which the card gardeners paint the white roses red contains a historical reference that any Victorian reader would have recognized immediately. The red rose was the symbol of the House of Lancaster. The white rose represented the House of York. These two royal families clashed in the War of the Roses, one of the bloodiest periods in English history, where the throne changed hands through assassination and execution. In the winter of 1461, the snow at Towton turned red with the blood of 28,000 Englishmen, the bloodiest single day in English history. Men executed simply for wearing the wrong color rose on their tunic. At Tewkesbury in 1471, Lancastrian supporters who had sought sanctuary in an abbey were dragged outside and beheaded on the spot. Their only crime? Loyalty to a red rose instead of a white one. The Duke of Somerset was pulled from the altar itself and executed in the town square while his blood ran into the gutters. The gardeners painting roses weren't following the arbitrary whim of a queen. They were representing the desperate attempts of subjects to display the correct political loyalty, to avoid execution.
Every time the queen shrieks for a head, she's invoking centuries of real English monarchs who did exactly that. Carroll was showing his readers that the violent, capricious authority of the Queen of Hearts was no different from the actual rulers who had ordered thousands of executions based on political whims. In an era when Victorian society prided itself on its order and civilization, Carroll dared to suggest that its entire system of authority was just as arbitrary and cruel as a card queen screaming for heads to roll. And his satire of power didn't stop at politics. It reached down to the very roots of society, the classrooms where the next generation was learning not to think, but to obey. Picture a classroom in Oxford in 1865, not far from where Carroll himself taught his mathematics lectures. 12 girls, standing in identical brown pinafores, backs rigid, hands clasped behind them. The air reeks of chalk and fear. They recite moral verses in unison, verses none of them understand. Questions are forbidden. Curiosity is a form of rebellion. The governess holds a thin wooden rod that has already struck 3 pairs of knuckles this morning for wondering about inconvenient things. Alice begins her journey as the perfect Victorian child. Head stuffed with multiplication tables, geography lessons, and moral poems memorized without comprehension. Watch what happens when she tries to use that knowledge in Wonderland. She tries to verify her own identity by reciting her lessons. 4 times 5 is 12, 4 times 6 is 13. Her geography goes absurd. London is the capital of Paris. Every piece of standardized knowledge she's been taught to memorize crumbles into nonsense. And here's the brilliant part. Carroll, the Oxford mathematician, made Alice's multiplication technically correct in alternative number bases. A sophisticated mathematical joke aimed directly at his academic colleagues. Alice's complete psychological breakdown, who am I in this world? Oh, that's the great puzzle, happens precisely because everything she's been taught to memorize has failed. Carroll was demonstrating that the Victorian education system, with its emphasis on mechanical memorization over genuine understanding, was producing children whose entire identity could collapse the moment their memorized facts turned out to be useless. But Carroll saved his most vicious critique for the end of the story, for the moment where all the threads of his accusation tie together into a single knot. The trial scene at the end of the story operates on pure chaos. Evidence is irrelevant. Logic is punished. Justice depends entirely on the Queen's mood. This wasn't fantasy. It barely even qualified as satire. In 1856, a case rocked London that could have come straight out of Wonderland. Mary Barrett, a seamstress from the East End, was brought before a magistrate for stealing a 3-penny loaf of bread. She had 3 hungry children at home and hadn't eaten in 2 days. The evidence was clear. She was sentenced to 6 months of hard labor at Newgate Prison, where she would die of typhus within 3 weeks. That same week, the Honorable Augustus Fitzhugh, son of an earl, appeared before the same court for beating a housemaid so severely she couldn't work for a month.
Multiple witnesses testified to his violence. He was fined £1, less than the cost of his morning champagne, and released with a warning. Victorian courts regularly put on trials just as arbitrary as those in Wonderland, where social status mattered more than evidence and sentences could be handed down based on the judge's mood. When Alice stands up and declares that everyone is nothing but a pack of cards, she's not dismissing fictional characters. She's expressing what Carroll saw as the ultimate truth about Victorian authority, that beneath all its pretensions of order and civilization, the powerful were nothing more than arbitrary tyrants playing with people's lives. Carroll had dissected the Victorian system, from the factories to the courts. But there was one file his family never wanted to exist. Everything we've analyzed so far is verifiable, documented. You can trace every element back to its historical sources, but there is a shadow over all of this that can't be resolved. Dodgson was a man with a striking number of close friendships with prepubescent girls. He photographed them extensively. He wrote them elaborate letters. He created personalized stories just for them. In Victorian society, where decorum governed every social interaction, these relationships raised eyebrows even in his own time. When Dodgson died in 1898, his family sat down with his personal diaries and tore out entire pages. Not random pages. The specific pages that covered the period when his relationship with young Alice Liddell was at its closest.
Picture that Oxford study just days after the funeral. It still smells of old leather and pipe tobacco. His sisters gather around the solid oak desk where he wrote his stories. Someone opens the diary to the entry of June 27th, 1863. They read it. Silence. A caught breath. Without a single word spoken, someone picks up a pair of scissors. The metallic snip rings out in the room. The pages fall onto the fire grate. The names Alice and Liddell, glimpsed briefly in Dodgson's precise handwriting, vanish in the flames. The family members took to their graves whatever it was they had read. You now know that Carroll encoded the horrors of Victorian England inside a fairy tale. That's documented. You can prove it. What those diaries said about the real girl, nobody knows that. And what that means, every reader has to figure out for themselves. Carroll didn't write a story for children. He wrote a code, and inside it, he encoded the industrial disease that was destroying hatters, the poison that silenced poor babies, the justice that condemned a seamstress for a loaf of bread, while it let an aristocrat off for a beating. He hid all of it inside a nonsense story with the precision of a mathematician who knew exactly what he was doing. The baby that turned into a pig, the Mad Hatter, was the worker destroyed by a disease everyone knew about and no one stopped. The Queen of Hearts was every monarch who had ruled through terror. And Alice, the girl who falls down the rabbit hole with her head full of useless lessons and comes out the other side questioning everything she's ever been taught, was the question Carroll couldn't ask Victorian England out loud. What if all your order, all your civilization, is just as absurd as a trial run by playing cards? Carroll could have said it plainly. He could have written the essay, the pamphlet, the exposé. He didn't. Instead, he dressed it up as a children's story. This is The Grimm Vault. The next tale, the story behind La Llorona and the whale Tenochtitlan heard before Cortez ever arrived.